broadly speaking, in response to this, the left has thought about these developments over the last few decades in one of two ways. Although I want to argue that the kind of spark I'm speaking to in terms of the Vancouver Socialist Forum and other places is an alternative way to think about these developments. I think the first way has been the argument that capitalism has fundamentally changed through the new technologies, the organizations of the firm, globalization, and so on. And it's required unions in the left to adapt to and transform their previous political projects and adapt to this new world. This, of course, is the position of third wayism and has become the dominant position of contemporary social democracy and the social democratic parties, the NDP in Canada. It's also penetrated quite clearly a lot of the civil society organizations, particularly in the NGO sector, and they've come in a way to accommodate neoliberalism rather than confront or resist it, and have become integrated in a sense into the politics of neoliberalism. A second way of looking at this is, of course, is to think about the developments over the last couple of decades and think of them largely as quantitatively increasing the internationalization of capitalism and the rollbacks of workers' living standards, but in some senses that nothing is new in this. And to some extent seeing it as a continual aspect of the crisis that began to form in the 1970s, and it remains characteristic of contemporary capitalism. In this sense, that neoliberalism in contemporary period is mainly thought of in terms of a capitalist response to an economic crisis that it can't resolve. And therefore that the old thinking about the nature of capitalism or the present period, and particularly our old organizational forms, are still sufficient means to address this period. I think both of these positions either exaggerate the changes that have occurred or fail to understand many of the current contradictions, problems, and forms that capitalism has taken on. In particular, I think fails then to analyze the way we have to not only understand this phase of capitalism, but also begin to think through what are the new necessary organizational changes and developments we'll have to take on to be able to confront neoliberalism and begin again putting on an alternative to capitalism. In other words, to begin again rethinking and making possible a 21st century socialism, to take up the terms that Chavez has given us. Finally, I think we also need to think of the way that the state structures and neoliberalism has formed inside the state. It's often said in this period that neoliberalism has been anti-state and been pro-market. But I think this really misses the point, the way that the state has been transformed internally. I don't think we see any less state, but its forms of its structures have changed significantly. Particularly its distribution or redistributional forms of state activity have become relatively marginalized. But those parts of the state that deal with economic issues have formed something that we could call, loosely has been reformed into often special parts of the state. That is, they've been given increased strength. Those parts of the state that deal with the internationalization of capital, that deal with the insulation of production activities from democratic accountability, the way central banks have been reformed. Systematically then the state has been restructured to strengthen those apparatuses of the state relative to those that deal with distributional interests. They've also been strengthened in a way that's removed them relatively from parliaments. Increasingly they're exercised by executive branches of the state. And what's increasingly occurred, then they're exercised by executive branches that are often not accountable directly to the range of political representatives. In other words, there's increasingly forming state structures, particular special relationships with the capitalist classes. You can see this partly in the secret meetings that were held in the Alberta BAMP, I think it was last year, with the meetings that was held in secret between the major groups of the capitalist classes in the U.S. and Canada, several cabinet ministers, and state officials, right, held in secretly, mapping out more or less where the Security and Prosperity Initiative is to go. This is not untypical. There are whole branches of the state in all countries which are operating in this same fashion. The other part of this is, of course, to go alongside this, we see that all the coercive or imperialistic apparatuses of the state have also been strengthened, whether it's the military arms, the security arms, and so on. So in other words, we haven't seen less state in this period. We've seen a different state and a transformed state. I don't think in response to these developments, it's a question of alternatives, in the sense of the left does not have alternatives to respond to this. I think if we look at the amount of theoretical models that exist, conceptual thinking across a wide spectrum of political positions, there's never been more thinking about how to address this particular, how to provide alternatives or think about alternatives. I don't think it's even a question of past experiences with alternatives. Past experiences with alternatives have a range of mixed results, some of them positive at different points in time, some of them relatively negative. But when you're transforming and building a new society, one isn't going to go in one single flash to communism. It is going to be a complex movement, and we have good and bad experiences to take up. From Cuba, parts of the Soviet Union, parts of different aspects of Sweden at different times, but there's a range of experiences that show there are a range of alternatives. I also don't think it's a question of experiences of people actually struggling for alternatives right now. There are all kinds of people engaged in all kinds of non-market alternatives. And I don't think it's simply a question of a program. Or even the sentiment of most people. When we look at, as a political scientist, when we look at these kinds of surveys, the sentiments of people against capitalism and for an alternative are still very high. It's partly also even recorded in votes. The question is, again, relates, as I said at the beginning, I think it relates to rethinking and forming political capacities to undertake this project. And I think in that sense, we must kind of account for five particular things. The first thing I think we need to account for is, of course, that we're now in quite clearly a period of social democratic realignment. That is, social democracy, not just in Canada in terms of the NDP or the Parti Québécois, but internationally has realigned. It has realigned and accepted neoliberalism and has become incorporate that and is no longer posing as a redistributional alternative to neoliberalism. I think we really need to take account of that fact because it's very important to looking at the political terrain and the openings that are occurring. The second thing is, quite clearly, is that the various old left and new left politics have basically disintegrated. That's both the old left of the communist parties, the Trotskyist parties, the post-Trotskyist parties, and everything that the new left threw up basically also disintegrated in this period. In Canada, basically there are no significant left parties left. Outside the NDP, at various points in time there were important radical kernels. And basically the legacy of the new left in an organizational form is nil now in Canada. There's this bit of ideological legacies left, but in terms of organization it's nil. And so the terrain is completely open in a sense, and particularly wide open in a sense when we consider where social democracy is. The third thing is I think we need to account for is, of course, something that has been very important internationally, and that is the social form process. The social form process has operated as a larger social justice fair of resistance to globalization. We have to account for the fact that this has never had much cachet in Canada. The social form process has been incredibly thin inside Canada. Many people have participated globally, but the efforts at starting this in Canada have been particularly thin. And it's not because, people are against social justice here, but I think it's clearly because we threw up many years of trying these things. In the early 1980s, there were processes, particularly in Manitoba, that had quite a bit of cachet, built up probably the most prominent one in the Choices group. That doesn't exist anymore. In Toronto, we threw up a significant organization that was very important then for the general strike that occurred in Toronto and some of the general strikes across Ontario, and that was the Metro Network for Social Justice. Doesn't exist anymore. The wider social coalitional structures that occurred nationally don't exist anymore. And those that exist are largely on paper.